Hey there, CPO here, and welcome back to the Taro 680 Pro build, and this is going to cover the electronics, ESCs, and motors. I love my little Harbor Freight vise because it makes a great little ESC holder and actually makes a great heat sink as well. So I'm going to be taking off these battery wires and putting on my extended ones, as you might have seen in my previous video. I'm using a fat tip soldering iron, and as you can see, even with a lot of heat, these factory solder joints, they're lead free, so they take a lot of work to get off. So I just thought I'd share how I do this. I use a rosin flux pen and get some rosin on there. And the interesting thing that I do that I'm not sure is intuitive to most is actually add some of my own solder. It's kind of a, I forget what solder I use, but it's a lead silver mix. But in adding my own solder to the original, it allows for that metallurgy to change, and it softens up the entire thing. It does take some time, more time than I like, but if the more you add your own solder, the quicker this thing will come loose. Just don't add so much that it's all over the place. So then once I get those wires removed, I can rebuild those pads again by adding some of my own solder. And now the solder pads are a good mixture. I've got to prep up the battery wires by taking off the ends so that I can tin them. And that's about how long I make them. They don't have to be too long. And tin those up. This time I'm cheating. I'm bringing the wire to the solder. Usually I do it the other way around, but since the solder's hanging there, and I only have 2 to do, this is easy. A little bit more flux just to kind of get things flowing. And then adding my wire. And this actually doesn't take very long at all because it's got a good solder mixture now. So there we go. That's what it looks like with my new extended. These are 15-inch. So if you haven't seen the previous video on the ESCs, go look at that. It's on the Taro 680 Pro ESCs. Now I may as well deal with the motor wires and get the bullets put on those. So again, these are already tinned, but I want to re-tin them with my particular solder. That way I get the right mixture, I guess, metallurgy. I don't know all the technical stuff here, but it does help. And then I'm using my helping hands to get aligned with the bullets. The key here is that you want to make sure that however you have it set up, that you can have it perfectly still after you remove the soldering iron while it cools. Because you don't want that to move while it's setting, otherwise you'll end up with a cold joint. So I like to try and get everything as close to stationary as I can and have it all mechanically just in line and set up, and then that way when I let go it'll just freeze in place without any requirement of me to be the one holding it. Here's a close-up just for you. These are the bullets that came with my motors, and they're the shelf style bullets, and I like them. They're really easy. Without the shelf style, the regular like tube style bullets, I tend to use a different method. I tend to use my little torch. But with these shelves, it's kind of easy just to press down on there. When you add your heat from the top, make sure that the heat goes all the way down through both layers of solder and then they meld together. Don't just melt the top. Make sure it goes all the way through. Alrighty, so there we go. I've got all of these done. Look at all these bullets. Now I need some heat shrink tubing. And after a few minutes with the heat gun, there we go. So those are done. Now I need to deal with the other ends, the battery leads. So again, I'm going to go through and snip off and make the ends available to me for tinning up. This is pretty tedious work. I usually put a good podcast or an audiobook on or YouTube video or something to kind of listen to while I do this. It just takes so long. But if you can knock this stuff out all in one shot, it'll probably be a lot easier. All right, so I got my wires tinned, and remember this guy? This is the one I did in that last video. I wanted to show you how I did the motor wires. I decided to cut them about 5 inches away from the motor. I think that gives me enough room to nicely get it plugged into the ESC. A little extra room in case I decide to maybe use it for a different application. It's not so tight that it's not used for anything else, and would lay nicely against the boom. So what I want to do now is cut all of my other motor wires to be that 5 inches. So I just use a caliper and set it up. And actually what I did is I laid the caliper on a table, as you can see here, and then use that as a quick guide. Just lay. It doesn't have to be precise. Just lay, get it about 5 inches. And then I set the motor down on a table and knock them all off with one shot. With a good pair of cutters, that's it's pretty easy. So there we go. Now I've got to deal with tinning these wires. Now the interesting thing about these motor wires, I was concerned actually, is usually with motor wires, because they're shielded, they have some sort of an enamel coating for the windings that they tell you you really can't modify these wires. But that enamel coating on these multi-rotor wires doesn't go down all the way, so it works out pretty easy. Here's another free tip for you. On my helping hands, I have a magnifying glass. I actually use that as a little stand just to hold my parts. It works out really well. It makes a little shelf. Another word to the wise is, be careful with your motors. They have magnets in them. So as you're moving around the table with lots of screws and other metal parts, just be cognizant of where you set them so that you don't end up getting things into your motor that you don't want. I know that happens to a lot of people more often than they care to admit. So just be careful with that. And again here, I'm just using my helping hands to get a good mechanical layout first, and then soldering in the wire. And then that way, whenever I'm done soldering, it is held perfectly still while it dries. And just make sure you're adding in your solder from the opposite end of your iron. And the reason you do that is, it's easy to touch the iron and melt solder, but that doesn't mean you're actually getting heat distribution. But if you put it from the other end and you're melting solder into, it's going to draw towards the iron, towards the heat. And so you'll be sure that solder is flowing around in the right direction. This may be, old news to some of you, probably most of you, but I imagine there's probably somebody who might be trying to solder for the first time that maybe these tips will be helpful. Here's one more view for you. I just kind of show you how I'm setting the iron on one side and then running that solder through, making sure I fill up all that gap from the other side. And you can see that makes a nice little solder joint there. All right, so now I've got to get shrink tube. Bam! Through the magic of video, that is all complete, and probably another podcast or audio book down, getting those things done. But there we go. So now it is time to get our motors mounted on the motor mounts. So I had one done from the previous video on mounting the ESC. So now I've got to get the other 5 motors mounted to their respective motor mounts. And again, I'm using 2 screws down the middle. And I did get some comments on the last video. 2 screws is all you need. You don't need to put all 4 screws in. In my case, only 2 would work without doing any re-drilling. 1 isn't really enough because you might have some movement, but 2, is plenty. Here's another free tip. Lay a piece of Scotch tape down and use it to put a dab of thread lock on. And you can see here, the tape won't absorb it. It'll stay right there for you, and it won't dry out very fast, and you can use it, dip all your screws in. So there we go. Got all the motors on the motor mounts. Now what I want to do is get my ESCs mounted to the bottom part of these motor mounts. So just like I did from the last one, the last video and that first ESC I did, I'm going to mount them a little bit backwards, and you can look at that other video for all of that. The one thing I want to do here is split the shrink tubing or shrink wrap from the motor wire side of the ESCs to make that a little bit more flexible. So what I'm doing is just pushing the razor down through to the table, and then instead of moving the razor, I'm just pulling the ESC away. That's seemed like a convenient way to make sure I don't accidentally cut up my ESC. Then I feed the battery wires and the flight controller wire up through the bottom, through that little crevice, and get everything, pushed down where it needs to be. Let those motor wires kind of splay out where they need to, and then using a single zip tie through the top or the backside, depending on how your perspective is, and cinching that thing down. So that's it. That gets my motors and my ESCs ready. And the next thing I really want to do is just get my mounts put on the booms and my wires through, and then my wires soldered to my PCB. And that's the next video, so stay tuned.